Joining me now on the Boardwalk Honda hotline, Michael Kaskey-Blomain, our 97.3 ESPN.com Sixers insider. Follow him on Twitter at @TheRealMikeKB for all your Sixers and NBA news. Mike, how you doing on this Saturday?
I'm doing pretty well, Josh. Thanks for having me on.
Appreciate you coming on. So, obviously, the first thing I got to jump with you on is about Joel Embiid. Shams Charania, he's the only guy I really saw reporting this so far, but he has said that he thinks Joel Embiid will be back tomorrow. Brett Brown said yesterday before the game that he expects Joel Embiid to be back soon, but wouldn't put a date on it. So have you heard anything new on the Joel Embiid front?
Not specifically new. I've heard that he's been progressing well. If this was a playoff situation, like a playoff series, he would, from what I've heard, he'd be able to go. It's more of, at this point, kind of a precaution to make sure that he is, as close to 100% as possible for the playoffs. Obviously, this game tomorrow against the Pacers is pretty big in terms of seeding for the Eastern Conference. It's one that the Sixers would certainly like to have in the win column. So I think having Joel back for that game would obviously be to their advantage. I think it's something that they would like, assuming that he continues, today continues progressing, and then in shoot around before the game tomorrow. If everything continues to go, in the right direction, I do think there's a good chance that we will see him back out on the floor tomorrow, but that's not, nothing has been officially announced by the team at this point.
There's been conjecture that this might be more serious than let on, and Mike, I want to ask you, on one, do you think that this knee tendonitis issue is more serious than was previously thought? And two, how much of them holding him out is not really as much the knee as much as getting him in game shape down the stretch?
Yeah, Josh, that's a good point. I think it's a combination of both. From everything I've heard, the knee's not, it's not a huge issue. The MRI came back clean. There should be no long-term damage. I think it's more just a matter of them making sure that he doesn't, do anything on the knee that could potentially cause long-term damage. I don't think there's a big level of worry within the organization. It's more just, as they've done with Joel from the jump, since they drafted him in 2014, it's more just a matter of, being extra cautious rather than falling on the other side of the fence and trying to get him back sooner than later. So I don't think that there's, obviously a big level of concern. I think the main thing was just to, give him enough time to make sure that the issue doesn't develop into something that could be a long-term concern. But for right now, I don't think it's, something that could potentially be an issue moving forward past this season. I think they just want him, to be as healthy as possible coming into the playoffs. He missed a lot of games in the stretch of last year, obviously when the face issue with the orbital bone down the stretch, and then he was a little bit rusty coming into the end of that Miami series. So I do think that they want to get him, back before then, obviously with plenty of time before the playoffs to get back in game shape, like you said. So I think it's definitely a combination of those factors, but not necessarily a long-term concern with the knee.
Josh Harris made the comment about, basically they're the organization's view of Joel Embiid, and not to really rehash everything that Harris said, but, is there a part of this also with Embiid that the organization is saying, look, the Warriors are still the Warriors. They're going to win the championship. The Eastern Conference is in flux. Elton Brand made the comment they did the Woj about how he expected to be a lot of shakeup and a lot of upheaval this offseason. Is some of how they're handling Embiid a long-term play? I know fans don't want to hear that because, we live in a microwave society, right, Mike? Everyone they want to hear, they want it now, they don't want to wait for it. But the reality is that it takes time for you to build a championship team. And if the Sixers organization is saying, look, we didn't Embiid 100% for a playoff run and going into another offseason, on top of the fact that we know we're not going to win the championship most likely this year.
Yeah, I think that's a combination, Josh. I don't think they would necessarily concede. Like, I don't think Elton has said, we're not going to win the title this year. Obviously, I think they're very well aware of the Warriors and their existence, and I think certainly the moves they're making are, with that in mind, that, it's not necessarily win this year or bust type thing. And obviously keeping Joel healthy long-term is their main goal, especially going into, what's going to be another really important offseason. You want Joel healthy to, be able to recruit, bring Tobias and Jimmy back and say, like, hey, Joel's here, he's healthy, we can just keep building. If they want to recruit other outside guys, it's a lot easier when you have a healthy Joel ready to go as opposed to a guy that's, coming off of an injury issue. So I do think that absolutely keeping Joel out, for this period of time is certainly with one eye on the future. If it was, all about this season, I think he would already have been back out on the court. He's basically said as much, in terms of if he needed to be out there, he could be. So yeah, I definitely think that Josh Harris made comments a couple weeks ago, obviously, about how Joel is, the centerpiece of the team, and that's how they're operating. They want him healthy for the next, 5, 7, or 10 years. So it's not, they're not, all their eggs aren't in this basket. Although I do think that there's a sense within the organization that this team could, at least get to the finals this year with a healthy Joel and come out of the East. So it's, a balance of those two things. They want to be as good as they could be this year, but obviously they also want Joel to be as healthy for as long as possible moving forward.
Michael Kaskey-Blomain joining me on the Roll Kind of Hotline on 97.3 ESPN. Follow him on Twitter at the real Mike KB. Mike, transitioning to the team that's been on the court without Embiid, they've stayed above water. They've won some games, but last night seemed to be a reflection of a problem that's been going on for a few weeks. I think it's a topic that I don't think has been talked about enough, and you could tell me if I'm making too much of this or not. But doggone it, 11% from three is bad, man. You cannot jack up that many threes and only hit 3 of them. And to me, I know J.J. Redick addressed it on his own podcast saying that, hey, look, I've been in a horrible shooting slump, but it's not just been J.J. Most of this team has not been hitting from the outside. And that, to me, that's not much a reflection of Embiid up being the floor. That's a reflection on guys just not getting the job done. Should we be or should we not be concerned about the fact that this team has been this erratic as a shooting team, despite the fact that you have all this talent like Tobias, like Jimmy Butler, and like JJ out there on the court?
Yeah, definitely a concern, especially considering the way that, the style of play that the Sixers like to play, where there's so much of an emphasis on their ability to space the floor for both Joel in the post and for Ben, on the break and kicking and looking for shooters. The way that the Sixers play, there's so much of an emphasis on that three that when they're not knocking it down at a steady, reliable pace, like you mentioned, as we've seen over the past few games, it becomes really difficult for them on the offensive end. That obviously starts with JJ. He's the most, dynamic, prolific shooter on the team. And when he's slumping and not getting his normal, 4 or 5 threes of production, other guys need to step up. And we just haven't seen that. Jimmy Butler, unfortunately, has been shooting really poorly from 3. Over the past few weeks, he's almost been a non-factor from long distance. It seems like he's kind of hesitant to shoot. Tobias really has been the only consistent one, on the team. Mike Scott has been up and down. He's had some games where he comes in and knocks down a handful, some games where he's unable to connect. So I do think it's a concern. And it's something, last year you saw them go on that run and, go into have the solid first round of the playoffs against Miami and get to the second round. And not to, rehash what people have said a million times, but that was after, they added those guys like Ersan and Marco that were able to space the floor for those guys. And you knew that they were going to be consistent. You knew that they could knock it down game in and game out. And outside of JJ, who hasn't been shooting well right now, the Sixers don't really have that. So I definitely think, if these guys can't find their rhythm in terms of Jimmy, JJ, a little consistency from Mike Scott, they obviously traded Landry away, who was their second most prolific 3-point shooter behind JJ. I definitely think it could be an issue going into the postseason for sure.
Is there a simple solution for the Sixers offense moving forward? Or is it just guys got to shoot and just try to get out of the slump? Because I know a lot of times when we're watching games, we're trying to figure out sometimes, look, what can the team do better? But if guys are just not executing, I don't know that's really anything that Brett Brown or the coaching staff can do. It's just on the players to play better. I mean, I know people made fun of Kyrie after their one loss where he was saying, we got to play better. I got to play better. But sometimes is it just as simple as that guys just have to do their job and perform better?
Yeah, Josh, and I think last night was a great example of that. We knew Joel wasn't playing, so the deck was a little bit stacked against us. But I thought you just saw last night, no one really stepped up in his absence. No one really exceeded their role. These guys struggled, as we were just talking about, from shooting. And I'm not saying Brett Brown is completely blame-free. I'm sure there's tweaks and things that can be made. But at a certain point, he's not out there missing these threes. He's not, turning the ball over in transition. some of these things that the players need to take the responsibility for themselves. And I do think that that's something that we've seen with this team, especially with Joel out. There's just times where the guys need to play better. And obviously there's certain situations that Brett could do to put players in position to succeed. But I think we've seen him do that at certain times, move in. We've seen Ben in the post a lot more. We've seen Jimmy as the primary ball handler in crunch time situations a lot more. We've seen him use Tobias in basically every way imaginable on the offensive end in pick and rolls and ISOs as a floor spacer. So I think we've seen Brett be, pretty open and creative on the offensive end. And at some point, it really is just a matter of, these are 4 all-star caliber players and a great shooter in J.J. Redick that make up the starting 5. And the bench is not one of the better benches in the league. I think it's 25th or 26th off the top of my head in terms of points per game, in terms of bench units in the league. Probably one of the worst benches of all the teams that are talked about as potential contenders. And at that point, more of it's just going to have to fall on the starters. They're going to have to carry a bigger load, which is the case in general. Once postseason play starts, there's more emphasis placed on the shorter rotation and the starting players. But, obviously once Joel comes back, I think it'll be easier. But I do think we need to see guys like Jimmy, Tobias, and Ben, not that they haven't been stepping up, but I think even to, step a little bit further up in Joel's absence and to move forward if this team really wants to, kind of make up for their lack of depth and make some noise in this postseason.
You mentioned Brett Brown. I wanted to ask you as well. I always felt the perception of Brown has evolved since he came to Philadelphia. Coming from the Spurs, he was known as a guy who was part of, player development. Spurs were an organization that always played team defense, was really good on the defensive end. But we've heard comments this week from a guy like Tobias Harris when he was asked about playing in Philadelphia. And he said part of the reason why he likes playing here is because he likes playing for Brett Brown. He talked about how Brett Brown's offensive mind, his offensive strategy. We've seen J.J. Redick. He's had the best career years of his life scoring-wise, offensive efficiency, playing with Brett Brown. J.J. said, I wanted to come here to play with Brett Brown. Have we undervalued Brett as an offensive coach in a league where usually the offensive coaches are the big names like the D'Antonis? But a guy like Brett Brown, do we undervalue him as an offensive coach?
I think so, Josh. I do think so to an extent. I think people are, he certainly has his flaws. There's questions with the rotation at times. There's adjustments or lack thereof at times. But in terms of putting his players in a position to succeed on the offensive end, I think that's something that Brett has done incredibly well since the beginning. Like, even back in the quote-unquote process years when he had other guys that, he was able to maximize. A guy like Michael Carter-Williams thrived and won the Rookie of the Year. Robert Covington obviously turned into, from a G League guy into, a first-team all-defensive player, 40% three-point shooter, very valuable, a hot commodity in the league. You saw Jahlil Okafor, despite his deficiencies on the defensive end, average, close to 20 points as a rookie. And the list goes on. Obviously, Joel, I think he's maximized considering the glaring flaw in Ben Simmons' game, the lack of the jump shot. I think he's maximized and utilized Ben's skill set on the offensive end really well. Same with Joel. Same with Tobias. I think the one guy that has had a little bit of difficulty on the offensive end has been Jimmy, because he's just such a ball dominant guy. He's used to having the ball in his hands. But overall, I do think that Brett has done a really good job on the offensive end in terms of putting his players in a position where they can do things to create for themselves. JJ, obviously, like you said, is another one. So I think in terms like Brett, he gets his fair share of criticism, but I do think that there's also positives. He has the team right around top 10 in offense and defense 2 years in a row, and I think that's definitely a testament to his ability to relate to his guys and also to use them in positions to benefit themselves and the team.
You mentioned the defense. The defense has, at least eyeball test, not looked as good this year as it was last year. I feel like guys are not, either not switching at the right time, or their assignments are not correct, or maybe they're not in the right places at different points. Obviously, the end of the Bulls game is the extreme of that. We know that Lloyd Pierce is no longer here anymore. Can we point to some of the lapses on defense is the fact that Lloyd is no longer here? And if it is because Lloyd is no longer here, is that an issue that Elton needs to address with Brett this offseason, that they need to find a better assistant coach for Brett to handle the defense?
Yeah, Josh, I definitely think that it's definitely fair to say that the team misses Lloyd Pierce. He was a huge part of obviously their defensive strategy and approach last year. It earned him a head coaching job, basically, how well he anchored the Sixers defense from the sideline last year. So I do think, obviously depending on what continues to happen going forward, that it's something they'll look into. But also I think some of it, last year he was dealing with a team that was pretty unified throughout the season, and not this. Anytime you mention the fact that it's been such a different roster this year in terms of trades, people say that it's an excuse. But especially when it comes to defense, which relies so much on communication and familiarity with your teammates and where they're going to be, I do think that some of the drop-off, in addition to obviously missing Lloyd Pierce, I do think some of the drop-off can be pointed to the fact that, the roster has just been so different, and Brett has basically had, 3 different iterations of the team to work with throughout the year. The team that, came into the season, the team after the Jimmy trade, and then the team after the Tobias trade. 3, basically different units, completely different bench. And I do think a lot of that, lack of communication, like you just said at the end of the Bulls game, where there was that miscommunication between Jimmy and Mike Scott. That's 2 guys that have played, 6, 7, 8 games together, probably less than, 40 minutes on the court, something like that together. So I just think the familiarity isn't there, where in terms of, a team like last year where they've played together, some of the guys had been together for the year, practiced the year before coming into the season. There was more of a, they like to say about defense, all the players are on a string. And I think you saw that last year more so than this year. And I just think that the turnover of the roster has definitely played a part in that, in addition to the fact that obviously they lost a great defensive mind in Lloyd Pierce.
Mike, one more before I let you go. I appreciate your time. Again, remind folks, tomorrow, Sixers versus Pacers. Pre-game coverage begins at 3 p.m. Tip-off right after 3:30 right here on 97.3 ESPN. Mike, Elton made a comment in that Woj pod, and I thought it was poignant because at the end of the quote, because he was asked about Tobias Harris. At the end of the quote, he mentioned the fact that they're not going to bring in guys here that are going to disrupt chemistry. And he said, like you see with other teams around the league. People have pointed to the situation in Boston that it's difficult. It's been a difficult chemistry issue. We know about LA with the Lakers and LeBron. There's been suggestions that, as soon as Carmelo Anthony left OKC, that the Thunder have just been a better team overall. In basketball, do we put enough value on the fact that sometimes guys just like playing with each other? Do we not value enough that sometimes chemistry can destroy a team's chances at winning a championship?
Josh, I don't know if it's that we don't value it enough or value it too much. I think it's just so hard to quantify chemistry. You know what I mean? It's one of those things that you can't put neatly on an analytics spreadsheet on NBA.com, or you can't, put on the box score that gets handed out to us after the game or anything like that. It's so hard to really judge the chemistry the players have and like how that impacts on the court. Like some players are able to not get along off the court and, be great together on the court, and then there's other players that obviously play better when they're playing with guys that they like. So I mean, obviously, anyone that's grown up playing basketball at any level, rec, high school, college, whatever, knows how important the chemistry is with your teammates. Probably everyone's been on teams where the team's not that good, you don't get along with the team, there's not that vibe. And then on the opposite, you're on a team where everyone really gets along pretty well, it flows well off the court and on the court. And you can't quantify it, but it does make a difference. So I definitely think that chemistry has a big part on the team. And I think, kind of harping back to what we were just talking about, not that this team now doesn't have chemistry or won't find it. It's just that there's been so much turnover and there's so little shared playing time with some of these new guys that chemistry is still developing. And you're seeing that, whereas last year, especially by this time last year, when they were in the midst of that, 17-game winning streak to close the season, the chemistry on that team had been, solidified, and it was clicking. And I think it's hard right now because it's not to that point with this new unit, and where, a lot of people are, kind of harking back to last year and comparing it to what the team looked like chemistry-wise then. And it's just not there yet. And, realistically, there's a chance that it's never going to be there with that unit in terms of Jimmy, Tobias, Ben, and Joel. But, the next 5 weeks of the regular season and whatever happens in the postseason, I think, we'll all be able to see. And I think the front office, Elton, and the ownership are going to use it as, a trial run to really see if that 4-man unit can, bond that chemistry that could make them a successful perennial contender, or if there's, maybe a piece or two away, that a couple moves that need to be made.
Follow him on Twitter at @TheRealMikeKB for all your Sixers and NBA coverage. He covers the Sixers for 97.3 ESPN.com. Mike, real quick before I let you go, by the way, is there any answer to why Jimmy Butler is out there looking at the Karate Kid with that headband?
No, I'm not sure, but I think I'm definitely going to have to ask him about that, because it's definitely an interesting look.
It's been a talking point to the point now where I don't know how much you saw of the national broadcast, but they even brought it up last night on ESPN. So I'm wondering, there's got to be a story about that. We know Jimmy doesn't do anything, half effort. He does things for a reason. He has a reason for everything he does. The story about the minivan and everything. So if you get that out of him, you got to tweet it out for us, okay?
Definitely, Josh. That's going to be my mission for tomorrow.
All right, Mike. Appreciate the time on a Saturday.
For sure, man. Good talking to you.